my world that I want to have a little pride in. My world, and it's not a place I have to hide in. Life's not worth a damn till you can say I am what I am.
Good afternoon and welcome to Dublin City FM. You're listening to LGBTQ Live with myself, Mick FitzGerald, and very shortly I will be introducing my guest for the day, which is Stephen O'Hare, who is the CEO of TENI. Now, for those of you watching the video, I am going to declare a conflict of interest. I have a TENI t-shirt. I also have an I am with Team TENI bangle, and yes, I am a member of TENI, so if anybody has an issue with that, I'm sure you know what to be able to take it up. Anyway, Stephen, you're the CEO of TENI. Welcome to Dublin City FM, and of course welcome to LGBT Live.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Stephen, I first came across yourself back in the day at an event called, I think it was called Outing and Identity. It was a booklet that was produced. I think your contribution might have arrived just a little bit too late.
It did.
But you remember, at the time you were with ICCL.
That's right. Yeah. I was with the Irish Council for Civil Liberties for about 7 years, working on human rights and principally issues around equality. And I had worked a number of times with TENI on different projects.
You did, indeed.
And that was one they asked me to contribute to. Unfortunately, my contribution that time was too late to be in the published version of the book. I think it went on the website. But yeah, that was a good day. That was a good day.
Yeah, well, for anybody who is interested, we have a copy of that. Your address to the event at Wood Quay, and that is available on our website, LGBT Live.
Great.
Yeah. So, Stephen, how did you get involved in TENI then? Because, as I say, I always knew you as somebody who was parallel to TENI rather than completely involved.
Well, two things. One, last year, obviously, Broden Giambrone, who was a long time director of TENI, CEO of TENI, left for pastures new, and that opened up an opportunity with TENI. And where I came in, I suppose, for the past maybe 3 to 4 years, my working life in the ICCL, the focus of my work was on equality, and particularly LGBT equality. So I had done quite a lot of work on the referendum, and prior to the referendum in terms of the Convention on the Constitution, in order to sort of bring marriage equality for same-sex partners to a reality. And then as a corollary of that, there is the issue of gender recognition. And ICCL had been asked by TENI to make itself available from a human rights perspective to work on this issue, and we engaged quite extensively with Catherine Zappone's group, working on gender recognition, and with TENI on the various sort of drafts and iterations of how that should work. And so I had a good opportunity to sort of work in parallel or work and contribute to what TENI was doing, and was hugely impressed by how they did it, both from a board level and from Broden and the staff contribution and commitment to getting this over the line, and how they handled themselves through the whole marriage equality debate, and were able to sort of, have a very significant milestone reached at the same time, which was the enactment of gender recognition
in 2015.
Absolutely.
Yep. Am I right in thinking your background was in the law?
Yeah, I mean, while I was in ICCL, I've come primarily from a research background, and then I undertook a degree in law through King's Inns while I was in ICCL, which was interesting. You had to do both, a bit of a stretch, but yeah, I mean, working in human rights and working in the NGO sector, having a grounding in law is very important. It's very helpful, I suppose, is the way to look at it. You're dealing a lot with legislation, you're dealing with policy matters that relate to law reform, and so having a good understanding of how that works really helps to sort of to get you to the table and be able to sort of speak the language of those who can change policy.
Yeah, no, I was when I was more actively involved with TENI, what always impressed me was the focus, and the focus was all about changing the law first, and ultimately that proved successful. With that campaign itself, I mean, we talk about it now, we look back, but certainly for the first 3 or 4 years or thereabouts, it was not clear that this was going to happen, and it was never going to, ultimately what transpired was what TENI would have been very happy with. But that was touch and go almost up to the last debate.
I think so. Certainly my recollection of it was that earlier versions of the legislation wouldn't have been as progressive as what eventually was brought to the table.
That's putting it mildly.
I mean, one of the big issues, of course, and as well known, was that because there wasn't marriage equality at the time, somebody who was married and who was trans would have had to become single. So they would have had to get divorced before they could actually have gender recognition. And this is contrary to international human rights law, which says that kind of stipulation, that kind of criteria shouldn't be imposed on somebody. So when finally marriage equality did happen, it opened the door to something that would have been a bit more difficult. But I think what impressed me most about TENI was, independently of that issue, they were pressing for the human rights standard to be upheld for trans people, and I think that's what we still try to do. So
no, I remember, and I say to people, one of the most important days in my life, and I'm almost 70 now, was was it the 23rd of May, the day we had the count came in, and what really pleased me about that, it was nice to have marriage equality for all my LGBT mates, but what really made it important for me was the people I knew who were trans, who were not going to have to get divorced.
Exactly. I mean, what a criteria to have to put on somebody, and everybody's circumstances are different. So when eventually a couple of weeks later the bill for gender recognition passed, I mean, I remember there was huge excitement, and we were just so impressed with TENI, and to answer your earlier question, being so impressed with TENI, that's really what sparked my interest to go and work for them, and I was lucky enough to be the person selected, so I couldn't be happier.
I'd be interested to hear your recollection on this one, because one of the people who I give great credit to for the version that came in 2015 was Kevin Humphreys.
That's
because
right.
Kevin was new to the job, really, and the previous recommendations coming out of his own party were certainly what I would call less than optimum. But something and it happened about a week beforehand, I don't know if you recall it yourself, on the cover of Vanity Fair was Caitlyn Jenner, and I thought I'd be interested to hear your view on that, of how significant you thought that might have been, because I thought this is putting trans front and centre. It's mainstream now. It's not some sideshow for the tabloids.
I think what's interesting is, and
I'm certainly not using Caitlyn Jenner as a role model for trans.
I think what's very interesting, and I think you've seen it in the past few years, is that internationally the issue of trans, people being trans and people being non-binary, has really come to the fore, and it has become a touchstone for the human rights movement, and also people pushing back against the human rights movement. So as the winds come in, where you have various referendum and various law changes around the world, as those winds come in, there's becoming a focus on trans issues as something that it could be a bit of a battleground, but also it's a benchmark for where a society is coming to. I know there's great affection for Kevin Humphreys in TENI in terms of the contribution he made at the time,
and deservedly.
Absolutely, can't be downplayed. I think there was a lot of people at the time who were pushing very hard, like Catherine Zappone. John Broden was the person who brought this through her department, and now we see, as an extension of that, the current Minister for Social Protection, Regina Doherty, doing the same, being somebody who's holding the door open for trans people. But I think there's great affection for the people who did eventually put that through and create an Ireland where trans people enjoy some of the best rights they could enjoy anywhere in the world. Well,
now, although I'm not necessarily a Sinn Féin voter, in fact at times they probably give me a slap for some of the things I say about them, but one of the people who I think deserves a bit of credit is Angus Snoddick, because when I approached Sinn Féin first, they didn't even have an LGBT policy. Very quickly they developed one, and very quickly Angus introduced a private members bill, which pretty much would have been what emerged. But one of the things I wanted to say, and I think it's important, about how the media perception of trans has changed dramatically, because a couple, I won't mention their names, you'd know them, that I interviewed fairly soon after the marriage equality happened. I said, this must be fabulous because you don't have to get divorced now. And the wife was telling me, she said, well, they did an interview with the paper, and the first question the paper asked them was, are you now a lesbian? And I thought, oh, for God's sake.
There's a fixation on things like sexuality or bathrooms or facilities that the media tend to sort of focus on. To some degree, for some media outlets, it sells newspapers because it's one of those things, you know. When we look at a minority group, we tend to sort of look at the exaggerated, stereotypical things, or the things that are salacious or gossipy, or, you know, that people want to focus on. And it's a shame because it ignores the contribution people can make. And I don't want to sound preachy or, you know, in that way, but it is, because there's so much more of a contribution that people can make, and there's so much more interesting things happening in the community. It just ignores that, and that's a real problem. We don't have the same issue here that they have in the UK, where they're having that battle.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about. I mean, you must have been as disappointed as I was with this year's London Pride.
I mean, it's hugely disappointing. I mean, one of our colleagues, Taryn Glavin, who worked with TENI for so long, has gone to work for Stonewall.
With Stonewall,
and, you know, so was at the front, really, at the coalface of that issue. And it's very disappointing to see groups that would challenge inclusion and equality attempt to hijack something as positive as Pride. Our experience this year of Pride was obviously very different. We had Sarah as Grand Marshal.
Indeed.
We had TENI at the front of the parade, and we had trans people invited to come and walk with TENI as part of that celebration. And while you know, we were at great pains to say, you know, Pride must remain a protest. You know, it is about highlighting the difficulties that the LGBTQ community face, and trying to rectify those. At the same time, there's a celebratory element to it. For us to be able to celebrate that, it was astonishing, not astonishing, but it was so positive. But in such a contrast, in the UK, you've got this sort of nasty sort of
well, it's a reactionary
element that's been, I think, fueled, and I think many people think it's been fueled not necessarily from the grassroots of what would appear to be grassroots movements, but that's been fueled by other narratives, and you see those narratives in the media all the time, and it's unfortunate.
Well, I remember, and I think it was 2013 when Anna Grodzka, the Polish member of Parliament, she was Grand Marshal, led the parade, and TENI were again, and I think. Having been at the previous one where TENI was largely seen as a protest group, by the next year TENI was fully established in its own right, and this is something that has the organisation is built on up to legislation, and since you've taken over yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think an NGO in the current climate for NGOs in Ireland, there is a real need to be a professional outfit. There's so many restrictions now placed on what NGOs can and can't do. We have the charities regulations, we have the lobbying registration, and all of those things place an onus on NGOs to behave in a certain way and to act in a certain way, whether they're in receipt of public funds or private funds. You know, you can't campaign for political process, you know, you can't accept funding from outside the state to do things like that. So all of these things are make it difficult for NGOs who want to engage in that lobbying, engage in that advocacy, and so you have to find creative ways to do that, and part of doing that is engaging when an opportunity comes along. So for the gender recognition review, Sarah was invited to participate in that as an independent member. Of course, TENI also participated in the consultation and was keen to do that, and when those windows open, you have to find a way to do that. So with Pride, it gives us another opportunity to sort of have our voices heard and the voice of the community heard, and one of the things we did prior to the review was we had a consultation with members of the community in Outhouse, and we invited anybody that wanted to come and talk to us about what should be in the review and how should it look. And you know, when you get to, it was a bit unfortunate that the review report wasn't launched just before Pride. It was timing wasn't perfect, but we had hoped to be able to sort of stand up and say, you came and you spoke to us, we reflected that back in our submission to the Minister, and that's what's being reflected in the report, and that's a positive, and that's your positive. So that's what you want to do in those circumstances.
Again, without doing a party political, I'm hearing good things about Regina, that Regina Doherty, the relevant minister, that she grasped the portfolio. She had no background whatsoever, as far as I'm aware, certainly in trans issues, and I gather she grasped the portfolio fairly quickly and fairly succinctly. Without
a doubt. I mean, I think the minister has been the enthusiasm and the commitment with which the minister has approached this, it has been it's absolutely fabulous. She had the foresight to sort of get a number of independent experts to come on, which gives a group like this credibility. Very often you see government high-level reviews not include members of the community that they're reviewing, so whether that's travellers or whether that's other minority group, they don't get to sit at the table. This time we had a number of things. We had Mininia Griffith, who's chair of Belong to, as independent chairperson. That's a hugely positive step, because it gives the credibility from the community's point of view that somebody who's working on behalf of the community is there ensuring that those voices are heard. And then the voices, obviously we had Sarah as an independent member. We also had Tanya Murtala, Dr. Tanya Murtala from DCU, and we had Seamus Byrne, a young trans activist as well. So there's a huge amount of credibility there, and the minister has to be congratulated for putting that in place. Then you have the officials who seem to be who took very seriously the concerns that were raised by the families that came to speak, the members of the community that came to speak, the medical and legal professionals that came to give their opinion, digested all of that and then produced a report which I think the minister can be very proud of. And we hope and we hear that the minister is looking to advance this as soon as possible. So that's something we're hoping to work on.
Yeah, I read the submissions and I thought they were all very positive, except for the one that was, we're 25 Irish citizens who don't want to give our name, etc. So there's still opposition out there.
There is. And two things I'd say about that. I mean, the internet, it's a funny place, and it has bred a culture of people sort of being anonymous when they make their submissions. And I would say to anybody, if you have an opinion, stand over your opinion for starters. Another way, but that's up to them to do so. But there is negativity, but that's a very small number of negativity. The vast, overwhelming majority of submissions were positive and constructive and had good ideas. And I think the review group were able to look at those and say some of the suggestions here should find their way into our final report, because they're making sense. So we a lot of what we said, a lot of what Belong to said, and FLAC and other groups and individuals, a lot of what was discussed gets into the report. You'll have detractors and you'll have people out there who'll disagree, but I think in Ireland you see a very positive environment for the advancement of trans rights.
Yeah. Putting things in perspective, Stephen, the reason why there was a necessity for a review in the first place is because certain things that the community want, I'm talking about the trans community, and I suppose by extension the LGBT community, weren't satisfied in the original legislation, and therefore there was a requirement put in to review the legislation 2 years after enactment. We should also say to people that what's there at the moment, it's recommendations. It still has to be ratified, certainly by the Oireachtas. So can you just tell us, what were the issues there? What were the recommendations, I suppose? That's more important that's come out of it.
Well, there's quite a few, but there's the big headline ones, I think, are the ones that the media picked up initially, and that we have been sort of keen to sort of get out there. And they are the recognition that firstly, that if you're under 16 you should be entitled to legal gender recognition. So currently the way the law works, and people don't know, anybody over 18 can apply for a gender recognition cert. They make a self-declaration. It's a purely administrative process. There's no other intervention required. But for people who are 16 and 17, they could utilise a process to seek an exemption from the age barrier. But they would have to do that in a very onerous way. It required a court order to set the exemption in place, and the court required certification from medical practitioners, 2 medical practitioners in fact. So it was a very onerous, costly, lengthy, difficult process for people to go through. And when the group was looking at this, they thought, well, why should that be the case? Necessarily, is that a necessary requirement for legal gender recognition? And they found that it wasn't. And the second thing they did, having consulted with child law experts and medical experts and legal experts, was to determine that there's no legal basis for a difference between over 16s and under 16s, and that there's lots of reasons why somebody under 16 might need legal gender recognition and might want to apply for legal gender recognition, including the issue of somebody who's intersex, and where that distinction needs to be made very early. So that's a hugely positive step. The group has recommended it should be based on parental consent, recognising the position of the parents and family in the constitutional position of that unit. It should be just an administrative process. there's a straightforward revocation process if that's needed. So if somebody needed to rescind that gender recognition cert, or made a decision at some point in their childhood that they didn't want to do this, or they needed to change their mind, that would be straightforward and wouldn't penalise them, particularly later. Sure. And then that there would be some third party support for the family in question who needed it. Where there's disagreement, okay, you have to have a process.
Indeed.
There has to be some sort of process, an arbitration process, to help families come to terms with that. Sometimes it's disagreement between parents, sometimes it's family breakdown, sometimes it's not being able to find somebody to give consent or obtain consent for whatever reason, and there will be then a more legal process to do that. So that's a huge, that whole area around young people is absolutely massive. The other issue then that we were heralding was the issue of non-binary recognition. So the Act as it was is currently stated, there's recognition of people in the binary gender. So you can be
male or female.
Yeah. Doesn't give any recognition for somebody who doesn't quite identify in those circumstances, or doesn't identify is primarily in those circumstances. And so there's a spectrum in relation to gender, and we recognise that, and we meet people who tell us they are, as we would describe, perhaps non-binary, and there's lots of other terms people can use, but somebody who doesn't fit into those two categories. The current legislation doesn't allow for this. So from a legal point of view, what can be done to change it? Well, the group has recommended that they should have the ability to have their gender recognised. Now, how you do that is a question, and the review group and the minister will have to engage in a few more steps in order to determine exactly how that's going to be, but it will likely lead to some classification of non-binary gender that people can apply to, and we would know of people who would have obtained a gender recognition cert in another gender than the one which they were assigned at birth, but really would feel that actually non-binary is how they would identify. They couldn't do it, they wanted to have a gender recognition cert, so they'll be able to change their cert should the minister bring forward those proposals. That's very important. So those two areas around non-binary recognition and young people are critical.
What about intersex?
Intersex, again, you see, when you deal with the issue of the report recommends that all of the reforms available for non-binary people and for young people should be made available for intersex. And really, when you think about the classification, if somebody who is under 16 is able to change their gender, that should apply to an intersex person, and it will very often satisfy what an intersex person might be looking for, who may have, when they were young, been assigned incorrectly based on physical characteristics, and they have no option to change that. This will, once these provisions come in, if they come in the way suggested, the intersex person will be able to do that. And similarly with the non-binary gender marker. So the recommendations here will apply equally to intersex people, and that's really important.
Yep. Can I just move on something? And I think this is less legal and I suppose more how the whole issue of trans manifests itself in the real world, and that is health services. Now, my understanding is that essentially the whole issue of surgery has been taken out of the debate in that sense of the word, that recognition, gender recognition is not contingent on surgery. However, almost all the people I knew who had surgery had to go abroad. Now, I gather Simon Harris is looking into this issue. What can you tell us on that one, Stephen?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, yes, at the moment that option is generally exercised by going abroad, whether that's to the UK, and we understand that there's moves to ensure better access to services through, for example, services that are offered in the UK, and that's a very positive outcome. So we're hearing that there's positive news in that regard. Yes, it would be better to have all of the services that people require in Ireland. At the moment, we don't have that. My colleague Vanessa Lacey, who many people will know and recognise, works exclusively on the issues of health and education for TENI, and has worked with the Health Service Executive on their trans working group to improve services. Now, services are not perfect. They're far from it. There's huge waiting lists. But what we intend to do and what we try to do is to move the health services and the minister to a point where there We're investing in services. Those services are localised. People can access them regionally, and that would include all of the services that people need, whether that's hormone therapy, whether that's surgical intervention. You do eventually want to get to that point. Ireland's health system has a long way to go, as many health systems do around the world, but we're certainly working to push the Minister towards a better setup, better access for people, faster access for people, and to give people what they need.
Yeah. Just last but by no means least, Stephen, before we run out of time, I gather there's an event taking place this weekend from Liberty Hall to Fairview. It's nominally called Trans Pride. Can you just give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we're supportive of all grassroots activism in relation to trans issues, and we encourage it. We encourage people to get out and get involved. We see a number of groups have pledged that they will be there on the day. We know that the march is going to take place from Liberty Hall all the way out to Fairview. It's going to be quite symbolic, and it's something that TENI will be there. We'll be represented on the day, but we're mindful that it's not a TENI event. It's not a TENI protest. It's a protest that's been organised by grassroots individuals, and it should be for them to run that as they will. And again, it's Pride Month. People want to get out and express pride around trans issues, and we wholeheartedly support that.
Yeah. Final word, Stephen. We were just briefly alluding to this before we came on. Anybody who's a parent or even a citizen who thinks they may be trans or they may have a family member trans, TENI would obviously be the place to get to contact. How can they get in touch with you guys?
They can contact TENI directly, that's the first thing. But the other thing to say is every second Sunday, on the second and fourth Sunday of each month, we run the Gender Identity Family Support Line, and we run this in collaboration with LGBT Ireland, who run the helpline, the LGBT helpline. So it runs from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock on Sunday nights. You'll find details of that on LGBTI's website or on our website. But if anybody has questions, please do get in touch with us, either directly or through the helpline, and we'll be able to point them in the right direction.
Stephen Hare here, it's been a pleasure talking to you. We look forward to hearing more about TENI. That's it for today. I want to say thank you to everybody on the desk, and don't go anywhere because Brazilian coffee will be coming up next. I'm Mick Fitz, and we'll be back in a week's time.
My world that I want to have a little pride in. My world, and it's not a place I have to hide in. Life's not worth a damn till you can say I am.